4 ordinary Jefferson nickels, struck between 1990 and 1996, are quietly sitting in circulation right now, and some of them are worth thousands, even tens of thousands of dollars. Hidden errors, rare mint anomalies, and collector demand have turned these everyday coins into documented auction treasures, and most people have already held one without knowing it. Today, we reveal exactly what to look for. Step 1. The 1996 D Mintmark U.S. Jefferson Nickel is one of those quietly extraordinary coins that slipped into circulation during a year most Americans associate with the Atlanta Olympics, the Macarena, and the dawn of the Internet age. Yet beneath that unremarkable surface lies a story of minting precision, subtle rarity, and collector obsession that continues to build momentum decades later. Struck at the Denver Mint, this 5-cent piece carries the bold D mint mark on the obverse, positioned just to the right of Monticello on the reverse, a design that had been in continuous production since 1938 when Felix Schlag's winning design was first adopted. By 1996, the Denver facility was churning out hundreds of millions of nickels annually, which makes the idea of any single specimen being worth serious money seem almost absurd at first glance. But the reality is that within that massive mintage, certain specimens emerged with characteristics that would eventually send collectors scrambling through their change jars and estate collections with fresh eyes and renewed hope. The Jefferson Nickel series has always had a peculiar relationship with rarity, because unlike silver dollars or gold coins, nickels were meant to be spent, circulated, worn down, and forgotten, which means that finding one in pristine condition decades later is an act of almost archaeological luck. And the 1996 D sits squarely in that fascinating tension between mass production and accidental preservation. What makes the 1996 D particularly compelling is the specific context of its production year, when the Denver Mint was operating under significant pressure to meet demand for circulating coinage, while also managing quality control across multiple denominations simultaneously. And it is within this environment of high-volume manufacturing that certain subtle variations began to appear. Variations that would only become meaningful years later, when collectors and graders developed the tools and vocabulary to identify them. The standard composition of this coin is the familiar 75% copper and 25% nickel alloy that gives the 5-cent piece its distinctive pale silver-white tone. And when you hold a well-preserved 1996 D in your hand, you should notice a crisp, luminous surface that catches light evenly across both the obverse portrait of Thomas Jefferson and the reverse depiction of Monticello, with sharp details visible in Jefferson's hair, the steps of Monticello, and the lettering around the rim. But the coins that truly excite specialists are the ones where something went slightly differently on the press, where a die was worn or misaligned, where a strike was marginally off-center or unusually strong, or where the mint mark itself shows evidence of repunching or irregularity that suggests a human hand touched the die more than once during preparation. The visual appearance of a premium 1996 D Jefferson Nickel is something that photographs simply cannot capture, because there is a depth and dimensionality to a truly well-struck example that only reveals itself under proper lighting and magnification, where the fields appear almost liquid, and the devices rise from the surface with a sharpness that borders on the sculptural. Collectors who specialize in modern Jefferson nickels often speak about the steps of Monticello as the defining feature of strike quality, referring to the series of visible steps leading up to the entrance of Jefferson's home on the reverse. And on the finest 1996 D specimens, these steps are fully separated, each one distinct and crisp, a detail that requires both a fresh die and a perfectly calibrated strike to achieve. When you encounter a 1996 D with full steps, sharp lettering, and pristine surfaces free from the contact marks and bag abrasions that typically afflict circulating coinage, you are looking at something that survived a gauntlet of handling, counting, bagging, transport, and distribution without acquiring the damage that destroys 99.9% of its peers. And that survival story alone is what transforms an ordinary nickel into something far more significant. As the years passed, and collectors began to recognize the scarcity of high-grade 1996D nickels, a quiet but persistent demand built within the numismatic community, driven partly by registry-set collectors who needed the finest known example to complete their Jefferson Nickel sets, and partly by specialists who understood that certain die varieties and error types from this year were genuinely rare in any condition. Notable errors associated with the 1996D include instances of double die obverse, where the lettering and date show clear evidence of being stamped more than once with a slight offset between strikes, creating a ghostly doubling effect that is most visible in the letters of "In God We Trust" and "Liberty" when viewed under magnification. There are also documented cases of off-center strikes, broad strikes where the collar die failed to contain the planchet properly, and specimens with rotated dies where the obverse and reverse are misaligned beyond the normal tolerance. Each of these errors representing a moment where the mechanical precision of the Denver Mint faltered just enough to create something unique. These anomalies are not merely curiosities. They are the fingerprints of a specific machine on a specific day, and for collectors who pursue them, each one is a tangible connection to the human and mechanical processes that shaped it. When you begin to examine a 1996D Jefferson nickel for potential value, the first thing you must do is weigh it, because the standard weight of 5 grams with a tolerance of plus or minus 194 grams is a critical baseline, and any significant deviation suggests either a planchet error or a coin struck on the wrong blank, both of which can dramatically increase desirability. Next, assess the metal composition by observing the color and surface texture under natural light, because while the copper-nickel alloy should present a consistent silvery appearance, any unusual tunning, spotting, or discoloration could indicate environmental damage, improper cleaning, or in rare cases, a planchet that was improperly alloyed at the foundry. Check the strike alignment by holding the coin by its edges and rotating it slowly under light, watching for any rotation between the obverse and reverse designs that exceeds the normal coinage tolerance, and examine the rim shape carefully for evidence of clipping, shelling, or irregular thickness that might point to a minting anomaly. Most importantly, look for letter doubling under at least 5 to 10 times magnification, focusing on the motto, the date, and the mint mark itself, because even subtle doubling that is invisible to the naked eye can transform a 5-cent piece into a 5-figure treasure. And this is the precise moment where patience and attention to detail separate the casual observer from the serious collector. It is at this point that the conversation shifts from technical examination to the question that every finder eventually asks, and that is what a coin like this might actually be worth in the current market. And the answer is more layered and more exciting than most people imagine. Documented collector transactions and auction records for the 1996D Jefferson nickel show a clear upward progression that begins with minor die variations and lightly premium specimens fetching between $2,500 and $3,500 in the specialist market, figures that alone would represent an extraordinary return on a coin that most people would walk past without a second thought. High-grade examples that have been certified by major grading services at the upper end of the mint state scale have achieved documented results approaching $5,000, particularly when the full steps designation is confirmed and the surfaces are exceptional. And this is the point where a nickel stops being a curiosity and starts resembling an unexpected financial windfall, the kind of discovery that can quietly change someone's understanding of what pocket change can mean. When unusual mint anomalies enter the picture, such as confirmed double dies or significant strike errors that have been authenticated and documented, the value progression continues upward, with certain specimens reaching the $6,000 threshold at auction, a figure that, for many families, represents months of mortgage payments or a meaningful contribution toward a home down payment. The most desirable collector pieces, those that combine high grade with a recognized variety or error and a documented provenance, have crossed the $7,500 mark in recorded sales. And when you reach the tier of exceptionally preserved or uncommon specimens, the ones that represent the finest known or one of very few known examples of a particular die state or error type, documented results have reached $8,000. A sum that transforms a single small coin into a legitimate investment-grade asset. Unusual finds that carry strong collector demand, particularly those tied to a verified story of discovery or those that fill a specific gap in a major collection, have achieved results in the $8,500 range. And at the very top of the spectrum, extraordinary or historically significant examples of the 1996 Jefferson Nickel, the kind that appear perhaps once in a generation and generate genuine excitement among specialists, have reached documented auction outcomes approaching $9,000, a figure that for most people represents a once-in-a-lifetime discovery, the sort of find that makes the nightly news and rewrites a family's financial story overnight. It cannot be emphasized strongly enough that these values represent documented collector and auction results where applicable and are never guaranteed, because the coin market, like any market, fluctuates with demand, availability, and the broader economic conditions that shape what collectors are willing to pay at any given moment. Before any sale or purchase is contemplated, professional authentication is not just recommended but absolutely essential, because the difference between a $5 coin and a $5,000 coin can rest on details so subtle that only a trained numismatist working with calibrated equipment can identify them with certainty. And submitting a suspected premium specimen to a recognized grading service for encapsulation and certification is the single most important step a finder can take to protect both the coin's integrity and their own financial interest. The story of the 1996 Jefferson Nickel is ultimately a story about attention, about the willingness to look closely at something ordinary and see what others have missed. And it is a reminder that value in the numismatic world is not always declared on the face of a coin, but discovered through patience, knowledge, and a willingness to believe that the extraordinary can hide inside the everyday. And if you think the 1996 is remarkable, what is coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew about what a single small coin can hide, because the next piece in this series carries a secret so deeply embedded in its design that it went unnoticed for over a decade. And when it was finally revealed, it sent shockwaves through the collecting community that are still being felt today. Step 2. The 1995 Mintmark U.S. Jefferson Nickel looks so unremarkable at first glance that you could hold one in your palm and feel absolutely nothing. No tingle of discovery, no whisper of significance, just a worn little disc of copper and nickel that seems to belong in a jar on someone's kitchen counter, alongside rubber bands and loose buttons. And that is precisely what makes this coin so dangerous to overlook. Struck at the Denver Mint during a year when American coinage production was running at full throttle to replenish circulating inventories that had been depleted by recession-era demand, this 5-cent piece was manufactured by the hundreds of millions, stamped out on high-speed presses that ran nearly around the clock, and distributed into the economy with such efficiency that virtually every specimen was destined to be spent, lost, scratched, dropped into vending machines, or forgotten in the bottom of a drawer. The obverse bears the familiar left-facing portrait of Thomas Jefferson designed by Felix Schlag, and the reverse displays the stately image of Monticello with the bold D, Mintmark, positioned to the right of the building. And on the surface there is nothing about this coin that screams rarity, nothing that would make a cashier pause, nothing that would make a child pulling change from a piggy bank stop and stare. Yet beneath that aggressively ordinary exterior lies a story that has quietly devastated collectors who learned the truth too late. The production environment at the Denver Mint in 1995 was one of intense pressure and mechanical strain, because the facility was simultaneously striking pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, and half-dollars on overlapping schedules with dies that were pushed well beyond their intended service life to save on tooling costs. And it is within this atmosphere of industrial urgency that some of the most fascinating and least understood Jefferson Nickel varieties were born. Die deterioration was a persistent problem throughout the year, and while most worn dies simply produced weakly struck coins that entered circulation without incident, a small number of dies developed characteristics that went far beyond simple wear, developing cracks, chips, and distortions that transferred distinctive and sometimes dramatic features onto the coins they produced. The standard alloy of 75% copper and 25% nickel gives the 1995 D its characteristic pale tone, but collectors who have studied this year closely have observed that certain specimens display unusual surface textures and color shifts that suggest the planchet stock used during specific production runs may have had subtle variations in composition or annealing. Differences that are invisible without careful comparison, but that can signal something far more significant lurking beneath the surface. When you hold a premium 1995 D Jefferson Nickel under proper lighting, the details that separate an ordinary example from an extraordinary one begin to reveal themselves in layers, starting with the quality of the strike itself, because a truly well-struck specimen from this year shows full separation in the steps of Monticello, each step individually defined and crisp, along with sharp detail in Jefferson's hair and collar, and a boldness in the lettering that suggests the die was still in its earliest and most precise state when the coin was struck. But the specimens that have generated genuine excitement in the collecting community are the ones where the die was not fresh, but rather in a state of advanced deterioration that produced unusual and sometimes spectacular visual effects, including what specialists refer to as spitting features, where die cracks caused metal to flow into unexpected areas during striking, creating raised lines and anomalies that are unique to specific die pairs and production periods. These features are not errors in the traditional sense, but rather the fingerprints of a dying die, a record of metal fatigue and mechanical stress captured in copper and nickel. And for collectors who understand what they are looking at, each one tells a story about a specific moment in the Denver Mint's production history that can never be exactly replicated. The collector appeal of the 1995 D Jefferson Nickel has grown steadily over the past 2 decades, fueled in part by the realization that this year produced several die varieties that are significantly rarer than anyone initially suspected, and in part by the painful stories of missed opportunities that have become almost legendary within certain numismatic circles. There is the well-known account of a collector in the late 1990s who reportedly examined a roll of 1995 D nickels, noticed several coins with unusual features, and set them aside in a paper envelope that was later discarded during a household move, a decision that, if those coins were what specialists now believe they were, may have resulted in the loss of specimens worth tens of thousands of dollars. There is the equally haunting story of an estate liquidation in the early 2000s, where a jar of Jefferson nickels was sold at a garage sale for $2, and the buyer later discovered that one of the coins was a previously undocumented double die variety that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A discovery that turned a casual weekend purchase into one of the most talked-about finds of that decade, and served as a painful reminder to every collector who had ever dismissed a modern nickel as worthless. The known errors and varieties associated with the 1995 D read like a catalog of mechanical failure, and each one represents a specific type of breakdown in the minting process that produced something the United States Mint never intended to release. Double die obverses have been documented where the letters of "In God We Trust" and "Liberty" show clear separation and doubling, the result of the die being hubbed more than once with a slight rotation between hubbings. And these specimens are particularly prized because the doubling is often visible without magnification, making them accessible to collectors who do not have specialized equipment. Repunched mint marks have also been identified on certain 1995 D specimens, where the D mint mark shows evidence of being punched into the die more than once at slightly different positions, creating a shadowed or split appearance that is subtle but unmistakable once you know what to look for. Beyond these, there are documented cases of off-center strikes, clipped planchets where the metal blank was improperly cut leaving a crescent-shaped void, and perhaps most intriguingly, specimens showing evidence of die cracks that progressed across the face of the coin in patterns that have been matched to specific die states, allowing specialists to reconstruct the sequence of production and identify which coins were struck earliest and which came from the final moments before the die was retired. If you are examining a 1995 D Jefferson nickel with the hope of identifying a premium specimen, the process demands discipline and patience, beginning with a precise weight measurement using a calibrated digital scale accurate to at least 1/100th of a gram, because the standard weight of 5 grams with a tolerance of plus or minus 0.194 grams is your first filter, and any coin that falls outside this range deserves immediate and careful further study. Assess the metal composition and color by comparing the coin against known standard examples under consistent lighting, because while the copper-nickel alloy should present a uniform silvery appearance, any greenish tint may indicate environmental contamination, any unusual darkness may suggest improper storage, and any patchy or mottled surface may point to a planchet anomaly that could significantly affect value. Check the strike alignment by holding the coin by its edges and rotating it slowly, watching for any rotational misalignment between obverse and reverse that exceeds normal tolerances, and examine the rim carefully for any evidence of expansion, splitting, or irregular thickness, because rim anomalies on this year have been linked to collar die failures that produced some of the most dramatic and valuable error types known from this series. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, examine every letter on both sides of the coin under magnification of at least 7 to 10 times, looking specifically for doubling in the motto, the date, the mint mark, and the lettering around Monticello, because the difference between a common coin and a life-changing discovery often lives in a detail that is invisible to the naked eye and visible only to someone who knows exactly what they are looking for. The value progression for the 1995 D Jefferson Nickel is where this story takes on a quality that borders on the surreal, because documented collector transactions and auction records demonstrate a range that begins with notable die varieties and premium-grade specimens achieving results between $5,000 and $7,000, figures that would already represent a staggering return on a coin that most people would spend without a second thought. Higher-grade error coins, particularly those where a recognized variety such as a double die or repunched mint mark, is combined with exceptional preservation and full steps on Monticello, have reached documented results of $8,000 at auction, and strong mint-state coins that may not carry a recognized variety designation, but possess extraordinary strike quality, pristine surfaces, and verified provenance have achieved results in the $8,200 range. A figure that for many families represents a meaningful financial event, the kind of money that could cover a semester of college tuition or eliminate a persistent credit card balance. Unusual mint mistakes from this year, including confirmed off-center strikes and specimens with documented die crack progressions that have been matched to specific die states, have crossed the $8,700 threshold, and major error coins, those that combine multiple error types or represent a uniquely documented production anomaly, have reached documented auction outcomes of $9,000, a sum that transforms a single small nickel into something that resembles a small inheritance rather than a piece of pocket change. At the absolute summit of the 1995 D-market, exceptionally rare and documented error examples, the kind that are verified by multiple specialists, photographed, cataloged, and traced through a chain of ownership that confirms their authenticity and significance, have achieved private sale and auction results reaching $35,000, a figure that for most people represents a life-changing discovery, the sort of find that pays off a mortgage, funds a retirement account, or simply rewrites a family's understanding of what was possible from a coin they almost threw away. And it is essential to understand that these values reflect documented auction or private sale results, where applicable and are never guaranteed. Because the market for rare modern coinage is specialized, volatile, and dependent on factors that extend far beyond the coin itself. Professional authentication is not merely a recommendation, but an absolute prerequisite before any sale or purchase at these levels. Because the financial stakes are high enough that counterfeiting and misrepresentation are genuine risks, and only certification by a recognized grading service with expertise in modern United States coinage can provide the documentation and confidence that both buyers and sellers need to transact safely. The story of the 1995 Jefferson Nickel is ultimately a story about the cost of inattention, about the coins that passed through hands that did not know what they were holding, about the rolls that were spent, and the jars that were discarded, and the specimens that were lost to time because nobody thought a nickel from 1995 could matter. And it stands as a permanent reminder that value does not announce itself. It hides, it waits, and it rewards only those who look closely enough to find it. And the next coin we examine may hide something even more extraordinary, something that was struck by accident, overlooked for decades, and is sitting in circulation right now waiting for the right pair of eyes to finally see what has been there all along. Step 3. The 1993 P mintmark U.S. Jefferson Nickel arrived in American circulation during a year when the nation was watching the World Trade Center bombing aftermath unfold on television, when Whitney Houston dominated the airwaves, and when the Philadelphia Mint was quietly producing coinage that most Americans would never think to examine twice. And yet this specific 5-cent piece has become one of the most quietly fascinating specimens in the entire Jefferson Nickel series, precisely because it was so thoroughly ignored for so long. The Philadelphia Mint had reintroduced the P mintmark on Jefferson Nickels relatively recently, beginning in 1980, and by 1993, the facility was operating with a level of automation and speed that made individual coin inspection nearly impossible, which meant that anomalies, errors, and unusual specimens were slipping through quality control with surprising regularity and entering the money supply completely undetected. The obverse features Felix Schlag's enduring portrait of Thomas Jefferson, and the reverse presents Monticello with the small but unmistakable P mintmark seated just to the right of the building. And on a typical circulated example, there is nothing about this coin that would arrest your attention or suggest that anything unusual happened on the day it was struck. But the truth is that 1993 was a year of subtle mechanical chaos at the Philadelphia facility. And the coins that emerged from that chaos carry secrets that are only now being fully understood by a small and dedicated community of specialists. The minting context of the 1993 P is critical to understanding why this coin matters, because the Philadelphia Mint in the early 1990s was undergoing a period of transition in its tooling and die preparation processes, with new hubbing technologies being introduced alongside older methods. And this overlap created conditions where certain dies were prepared using techniques that produced microscopic variations in the finished coins. Variations that would have gone permanently unnoticed without the advent of high-resolution digital photography and online collector communities that emerged in the following decades. The standard composition remains the familiar 75% copper and 25% nickel blend, yielding the characteristic muted silver-white appearance that most Americans associate with a nickel. But collectors who have studied 1993P specimens in depth have observed that certain production runs display a slightly different surface quality. A subtle granularity or texture in the fields that suggests the planchets may have been annealed under inconsistent conditions, producing surfaces that are either unusually smooth and reflective or slightly rough and granular, depending on which batch they came from. These differences are not immediately obvious to the casual observer, but they are meaningful because they provide clues about which specific production period a coin came from. And in the world of specialized nickel collecting, that information can be the difference between a coin worth 5 cents and a coin worth 5 figures. The visual appearance of a standout 1993P Jefferson Nickel is defined by a quality that collectors describe as sharp and alive, meaning that the devices appear to have a sculptural depth and crispness that is absent from the vast majority of production. And this is most evident in the fine details of Jefferson's portrait, where the strands of hair, the contour of the jaw, and the fabric of his collar should all be rendered with a clarity that suggests the die was in its earliest and most precise state when the coin was struck. On the reverse, the steps of Monticello are the traditional benchmark of strike quality, and a truly exceptional 1993P will show at least 5 fully separated steps, each one clean and distinct, a level of detail that requires not only a fresh die, but also a perfectly centered strike with adequate pressure, and a planchet that was properly prepared and positioned in the press. When you encounter a 1993P that combines full steps with pristine, unmarked surfaces, and a bold, even luster that flows across both sides of the coin, you are looking at something that survived a production and distribution process that was designed to destroy exactly that level of quality. And the improbability of that survival is what gives the coin its quiet but undeniable power over the collectors who pursue it. The collector appeal of this coin has been built slowly and organically, not through dramatic headlines or famous auction sales, but through the patient accumulation of knowledge by a group of specialists who recognized that 1993 was a year where the Philadelphia Mint's quality controls were stretched thin, and where a surprising number of interesting and potentially valuable varieties were produced. Among the most notable errors documented for this year are instances of double die obverse, where the lettering in God we trust and the word liberty show clear evidence of secondary hubbing with a slight rotational offset, producing a doubled or split appearance that is best seen under magnification, but is sometimes visible to the trained naked eye. There are also confirmed cases of die cracks that propagated across the obverse in distinctive patterns, creating raised ridges of metal that trace the path of the crack and give each affected coin a unique fingerprint. And these crack patterns have been cataloged and matched to specific die states, allowing collectors to identify not just the variety, but the approximate position of the coin within the die's production life. Additionally, specimens showing repunched mint marks have been identified, where the P appears to have been punched into the working die more than once at slightly different angles, creating a shadowed or doubled appearance in the mint mark itself. And these coins are particularly sought after because they represent a direct human intervention in the die preparation process, a moment where a technician's hand made a mark that would be preserved in metal and distributed across the country. The emotional dimension of the 1993P story is rooted in the concept of overlooked opportunity, because this is a coin that was produced in enormous quantity, entered circulation without fanfare, and was spent, lost, and discarded by millions of people who had no reason to suspect that anything about it was special. And the collectors who eventually recognized its significance did so only after years of patient study and comparison. There is a documented account from the mid-2000s of a retired schoolteacher in Ohio who had been sorting through a large accumulation of Jefferson Nickels purchased from a bank. and she reportedly identified a 1993 P with unusual doubling in the obverse lettering that had not been previously catalogued. A discovery that was later confirmed by multiple specialists, and that fundamentally altered the understanding of what this year produced. There is also the painful and recurring story of estate liquidations, where rolls of 1993 P nickels were sold at face value, or below, because the executor had no idea that within those rolls might be specimens worth thousands of dollars each. And these stories serve as a permanent reminder that the gap between recognition and disregard is often the gap between a life-changing discovery and a missed opportunity that can never be recovered. When examining a 1993 P Jefferson nickel for potential significance, the approach must be systematic and thorough, beginning with a weight check on a calibrated scale accurate to at least the hundredth of a gram, because the standard weight of 5 grams with a tolerance of plus or minus 0.194 grams is your first and most reliable filter. And any coin that falls outside this range demands immediate further investigation, as it may indicate a planchet error or a coin struck on an incorrect blank. The metal composition should be assessed by observing the color and surface character under natural daylight, because while the standard copper-nickel alloy should present a consistent pale tone, any unusual discoloration, spotting, or tunning pattern may indicate environmental exposure, improper cleaning, or in rare cases a planchet that was contaminated or improperly alloyed during production. Strike quality must be evaluated by examining the highest points of the design, particularly the steps of Monticello and the details of Jefferson's hair, because a weak or incomplete strike in these areas suggests either a worn die or insufficient striking pressure, while an unusually sharp and complete strike may indicate an early die state that is more likely to be associated with collectible varieties. The rim should be examined for any evidence of expansion, splitting, clipping, or irregular thickness, because rim anomalies on 1993 P specimens have been linked to collar die failures that produce some of the most visually striking and valuable error types from this production year. And every letter on both sides of the coin should be scrutinized under magnification of at least 7 times, looking specifically for doubling, splitting, or irregular spacing that could indicate a doubled die or repunched element. The value progression for the 1993 P Jefferson nickel is a story that unfolds in layers, beginning with smaller and more commonly encountered error types and varieties that have achieved documented collector and auction results ranging from $3,000 to $6,000, figures that would already represent an extraordinary outcome for a coin that virtually anyone could find in their change. And that for many families would represent an unexpected financial blessing, arriving from the most unlikely of sources. Unusual discoveries, including previously uncatalogued die varieties or specimens with combinations of features that had not been previously documented, have reached results of $6,500 in the specialist market, and premium high-grade examples that combine exceptional strike quality with pristine surfaces and verified provenance have achieved documented outcomes of $7,000. A figure that for many people represents the kind of money that could eliminate medical debt, fund a long-postponed home repair, or simply provide a cushion of security that had felt permanently out of reach. Significant error coins, particularly those where a recognized variety is combined with a dramatic visual anomaly such as a major die crack or an off-center strike, have crossed the $8,000 threshold at auction, and exceptional mint-state errors, those that preserve both the error characteristic and the original mint luster in nearly perfect condition, have reached documented results of $8,600. A level where a single nickel begins to resemble a financial asset rather than a piece of pocket change. At the highest tiers of the 1993 P market, rare misstrikes, including confirmed off-center strikes, broad strikes, and specimens struck on incorrect planchets, have achieved documented auction outcomes of $9,000, and the most extraordinary documented examples, those that combine extreme rarity with verified authentication, a clear production narrative, and strong collector demand, have reached results as high as $11,000 in private sale and auction settings. A figure that for most people represents a genuinely life-changing discovery, the kind of money that could serve as a down payment on a first home, fund a child's education, or transform a family's financial trajectory in ways that seemed impossible before the coin was identified. It is essential to state clearly that these values represent auction or collector sales where applicable and are never guaranteed, because the rare coin market is influenced by demand cycles, economic conditions, and the availability of comparable specimens, and a coin that achieves a strong result today may not replicate that outcome tomorrow without the right buyer and the right circumstances. Professional authentication by a recognized grading service is an absolute necessity before any transaction at these levels, because the financial stakes are high enough to attract counterfeiting and misrepresentation, and only certified encapsulation by a reputable service can provide the documentation and protection that both buyers and sellers require. The story of the 1993 Jefferson Nickel is ultimately a story about the cost of not looking, about the millions of coins that were handled and spent and discarded by people who never thought to pause and examine what they were holding. And it is a reminder that the next remarkable discovery may already be in your possession, sitting quietly in a jar or a drawer or the bottom of a purse, waiting for someone to finally see what has been there all along. And the next coin we examine may prove to be even more astonishing, because it was struck in a year that everyone remembers but that no one associates with coin rarity, and the secret it carries has only recently begun to surface. Last coin. The 1990 D mint mark U.S. Jefferson Nickel is the kind of coin that most people have probably held dozens of times without a single flicker of recognition crossing their face. A small copper nickel disc that looks exactly like every other nickel they have ever received in change at a grocery store or dropped into a parking meter. And that total absence of visual distinction is precisely what makes this coin so compelling and so potentially devastating to anyone who has ever dismissed it without a second look. The Denver Mint in 1990 was operating in a period of relative stability compared to the turbulent production years that preceded and followed it, which might suggest that this was a year of unremarkable output. But the reality is that stability in minting operations does not eliminate errors. It simply makes the errors that do occur harder to predict and harder to find, because they exist as isolated incidents rather than systematic patterns. The obverse carries Schlag's portrait of Jefferson with the date curved below, and the reverse shows Monticello with the D mint mark to the right. And on a circulated example, the surfaces are typically dulled, slightly worn, and completely unremarkable. But somewhere among the millions of coins struck that year are specimens that carry anomalies so subtle and so specific that they have only recently begun to emerge from obscurity, as collectors apply modern analytical techniques to coins that everyone else walked past. The production background of the 1990 D is tied to a specific moment in Denver Mint history, when the facility was balancing circulating coinage demands with the production of commemorative issues for the same period. And this dual responsibility placed unusual stress on die inventory and press scheduling, creating conditions where dies were sometimes swapped, reused, or pushed beyond their intended service windows in ways that produced unintended consequences on the finished coins. The alloy composition of 75% copper and 25% nickel is standard for the series, but certain 1990 D specimens have been observed with surface characteristics that deviate from the expected norm, including a slightly warmer or golden tint in the fields that some specialists attribute to variations in the planchet washing or annealing process during specific production batches. These tonal differences are extraordinarily subtle and require side-by-side comparison with known standard examples to identify. But they matter because they provide evidence of production irregularities that may correlate with other, more significant features. And in the world of specialized nickel collecting, the ability to trace a coin back to a specific production batch or die state is the foundation upon which rarity and value are built. The visual character of a premium 1990D is defined not by flashiness but by precision, because what separates an ordinary example from an extraordinary one is the degree to which every element of the design was rendered with complete clarity and fidelity to the engraver's original work. And this is most apparent in the fine details that are typically lost in mass production. On a truly sharp specimen, Jefferson's hair should show individual strands rather than a blurred mass. The leaves and details of Monticello should be crisp and distinct, and the lettering around both sides should be bold, and even with no softness or filling in the serifs and strokes. The steps of Monticello remain the gold standard for strike assessment, and a 1990D with 5 or 6 fully separated steps is a coin that was struck early in the die's life with full pressure on a properly prepared planchet, a combination that represents a tiny fraction of total production. But the specimens that have generated genuine excitement among specialists are not necessarily the sharpest ones, because some of the most intriguing 1990D varieties come from dies that were in advanced states of wear or damage, dies that had developed cracks, chips, or distortions that transferred unique features onto the coins they produced, features that are impossible to replicate, and that give each affected coin a one-of-a-kind character. The collector community's relationship with the 1990D has evolved significantly over the past 15 years, driven by a series of discoveries that gradually revealed this year to be far more complex and interesting than its unremarkable reputation suggested. Documented varieties include instances of double die obverse where the motto and date show clear separation under magnification, the result of the die receiving multiple hub impressions with slight misalignment between them, and these double dies range from minor and barely perceptible to dramatic and immediately obvious, with the more pronounced examples commanding significant premiums. Repunched mint marks have also been cataloged, where the D shows evidence of being punched into the working die at 2 or more slightly different positions, creating a ghosted or split appearance that is a direct record of human intervention in the die preparation process. Beyond these, there are confirmed cases of die cracks that traveled across the coin face in distinctive branching patterns, instances where die chips created raised lumps of metal in unexpected locations, and a small number of specimens showing evidence of collar die failures that produced irregular rims and partial broadstrike characteristics, each of these representing a specific mechanical event on the production floor that was captured in metal and sent into circulation without anyone noticing. The emotional weight of the 1990D story comes from the sheer number of people who have handled this coin without knowing what they were holding, because unlike rare dates from the early 20th century that were immediately recognized as significant, this is a modern coin that was spent freely, hoarded in jars, rolled in paper wrappers and deposited at banks, and used for everyday transactions by millions of Americans who had absolutely no reason to examine it closely. There is a well-documented account from the early 2010s of a coin dealer in the Pacific Northwest who purchased a sealed mint bag of 1990D nickels from an estate sale, and upon opening the bag and methodically examining its contents, discovered a previously uncatalogued die variety that had survived unsearched for over 2 decades. A find that not only added a new entry to the variety registry, but also raised immediate questions about how many other sealed bags from this era might still exist in bank vaults and estate collections, unopened and unexamined, holding specimens that could be equally significant. There is also the recurring and painful narrative of collectors who acquired rolls of 1990D nickels in the years after its release, noticed coins with unusual features, and set them aside without pursuing identification, only to lose track of them during moves. Divorces or estate liquidations, a pattern of near discovery followed by permanent loss that haunts the collecting community and serves as a constant reminder that opportunity without action is simply regret in a different form. If you are going to examine a 1990 Jefferson nickel with the intention of identifying a potentially valuable specimen, the process requires patience, the right tools, and a systematic approach that leaves nothing to chance, starting with a weight measurement on a calibrated digital scale capable of reading to at least the 100th of a gram. Because the standard weight of 5 grams with a tolerance of plus or minus 0.194 grams is your first and most objective filter. And any coin that deviates from this range may have been struck on an incorrect planchet, or may have suffered a structural anomaly during production that could dramatically affect its significance. The metal composition and color should be assessed under natural lighting by comparing the coin against multiple known standard examples, because while the copper-nickel alloy should present a consistent pale silver-white tone, any unusual warmth, spotting, or surface texture variation could indicate a planchet irregularity, environmental damage, or a production batch anomaly that warrants closer inspection. Strike alignment must be checked by holding the coin by its edges and rotating it under light to detect any rotational offset between the obverse and reverse that exceeds normal coinage tolerances, and the rim should be examined in its entirety for any evidence of expansion, splitting, thinning, or irregular contour. Because rim anomalies on 1990 specimens have been linked to collar die failures that produced some of the most visually distinctive and collectible error types from this production year. Finally, every letter on both sides must be scrutinized under magnification of at least 7 to 10 times, with particular attention to the motto, the date, the mint mark, and the lettering surrounding Monticello, because the difference between a common coin and a discovery worth thousands often resides in a detail that measures fractions of a millimeter and is completely invisible to anyone who does not know to look for it. The value trajectory for the 1990 Jefferson nickel begins at a level that would already surprise most people, because minor errors and recognized but common varieties have achieved documented collector and auction results ranging from $900 to $2,000, figures that represent an extraordinary return on a coin that virtually anyone could encounter in circulation. And that for many households would mean an unexpected financial boost arriving from the most mundane possible source. Unusual misstrikes, including specimens with confirmed off-center characteristics or partial collar failures, have reached documented results of $3,000, and premium high-grade examples that combine exceptional strike quality with pristine surfaces and full steps have achieved outcomes of $3,500, a level where a single nickel begins to feel less like pocket change and more like a small but meaningful financial event. Strong mint-state error coins, those that preserve both a recognized error characteristic and original mint luster in outstanding condition, have crossed the $5,000 threshold, and rare misstrikes, particularly those with dramatic visual anomalies or combinations of features that are seldom seen, have reached documented auction outcomes of $6,000, a sum that for many families represents months of living expenses or a significant contribution toward a long-deferred goal. Extraordinary collector examples, those that combine extreme rarity with exceptional preservation and a documented chain of ownership, have achieved results of $6,500, and at the very top of the spectrum, exceptional or one-of-a-kind documented discoveries, the kind that represent the finest known or sole surviving example of a particular variety or error type, have reached documented results as high as $9,000. A figure that for most people represents a genuinely life-changing discovery, the sort of find that could fund a business venture, pay for a wedding, or provide the financial foundation for a major life transition. It must be stated with absolute clarity that these figures represent auction or private sale results, where applicable and are never guaranteed, because the market for specialized modern coinage is influenced by collector demand, economic conditions, and the availability of comparable specimens. And a coin that achieves a strong result in one transaction may not replicate that outcome in another without the right circumstances and the right buyer. Professional authentication by a recognized grading service is not a suggestion but a fundamental requirement before any sale or purchase at these value levels, because the financial stakes are sufficient to attract counterfeiting, alteration, and misrepresentation, and only certification by a reputable organization with specific expertise in modern United States coinage can provide the documentation, encapsulation, and confidence that protect both parties in a transaction. The story of the 1990 Jefferson Nickel is ultimately a story about the extraordinary hiding inside the ordinary, about the reality that valuable treasures are still circulating through the economy right now, passing through hands that do not know what they are holding, sitting in jars and drawers and registers across the country, waiting for someone with the knowledge and the patience to look closely and see what everyone else has missed. If this video has opened your eyes to the possibility that everyday pocket change might hold far more value than you ever imagined, then make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next remarkable coin we uncover, because the series is far from over, and the next specimen we examine may be even more surprising than this one, and it could be sitting in your change right now, waiting to be found. And this has been your guide to the hidden world of valuable American coinage. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.